Hey guys, tonight we begin with a room you have probably seen in photographs or period dramas, the Long Gallery. That elegant space stretching the entire length of a great house, lined with windows on one side and portraits on the other, where aristocrats once strolled during inclement weather and displayed their wealth to visitors. Beautiful, prestigious, and absolutely impossible to heat. The Long Gallery was an architectural statement that declared, "We are so rich that we can afford to maintain a room that actively tries to freeze us to death." This is the story of how the people who lived in these houses fought back against the cold, using two weapons that history has largely forgotten, ashbanks and shuttertoths. And by the end of tonight, you will understand that these were not just heating solutions. They were the foundation of an entire system of household management that shaped daily life for centuries. The Long Gallery emerged as an architectural feature in English great houses during the 16th century, reaching its peak of popularity in the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods. These rooms were designed for display and exercise, providing a covered space where the household could walk during rain or cold without venturing outside. They were typically located on an upper floor, stretching 60, 80, sometimes over 100 feet in length, with large windows along the exterior wall to provide light and views. The windows were the gallery's glory and its curse. All that glass, in an era before double paning or effective weather stripping, was essentially a thermal hemorrhage. The room bled heat like a wound.
The physics of the problem were straightforward but merciless. Glass conducts heat roughly 20 times more efficiently than the stone or brick walls that surrounded it. A room with walls might retain heat reasonably well, but a room with one entire wall of windows might as well have no wall at all. The cold air outside pressed against the glass, chilling it, and the chilled glass radiated cold into the room while simultaneously conducting warmth out. On a winter night, the temperature in an unprotected gallery could drop to near outdoor levels within hours of the fire dying. Fireplaces helped, but only so much. Most long galleries had one or two fireplaces, positioned along the interior wall opposite the windows. These could throw considerable heat, but the geometry worked against them. Heat rises, pooling at the ceiling, while cold air from the windows sinks, creating a convection current that pulled warmth up and away while drawing cold down onto the floor where people actually stood. A person standing near the fireplace might be warm on one side and freezing on the other, while a person at the far end of the gallery, 50 or 60 feet from the fire, might feel almost no warmth at all.
Before we go deeper into how our ancestors solved this problem, let me ask you something. If you are the kind of person who finds yourself watching videos about Tudor heating technology at whatever hour it happens to be where you are, you understand that the grand houses we admire today were actually sites of constant struggle against the elements. Take a moment to subscribe if you want more of these hidden stories, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you are watching. I am curious who else is fascinated by the practical challenges behind historical elegance. Now, the ashbank was one of the primary weapons in the war against gallery cold. The term refers to a practice of piling wood ash, the residue from household fires, against the base of exterior walls and windows. This might sound crude, even absurd, but it was actually a sophisticated application of thermal mass principles that modern engineers would recognize. Ash is an excellent insulator. It contains countless tiny air pockets that resist heat transfer. A bank of ash piled against a cold wall or window frame created a buffer zone that slowed the infiltration of cold air and the escape of warm air.
The practice of banking ash was common enough that household accounts from the period include specific allocations for ash collection and distribution. Servants were assigned to gather ash from the various fireplaces throughout the house and transport it to where it was needed. The ash was typically piled in the late autumn, when temperatures began to drop, and remained in place until spring. In some houses, the ash banks reached 2 or 3 feet high, covering the lower portions of windows entirely, and creating a kind of insulating berm around the perimeter of vulnerable rooms.
Let me introduce you to a specific household whose records illuminate this practice. Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, built in the 1590s for Bess of Hardwick, is famous for its enormous windows, so extensive that a contemporary rhyme declared Hardwick Hall more glass than wall. The household accounts from Hardwick reveal a sophisticated system of winter preparation that included substantial ash banking. Entries from the early 17th century record the movement of ash from kitchen and chamber fireplaces to the long gallery, with specific quantities noted and specific servants assigned to the task.
The Hardwick accounts also reveal the scale of ash production in a great house. A household burning wood and coal in multiple fireplaces, some kept lit around the clock during winter, produced enormous quantities of ash. This ash was a resource, not a waste product. Beyond its use for insulation, ash was used in soap making, in agriculture, and in various cleaning applications. The allocation of ash to insulation purposes represented a genuine choice about resource distribution, which is why it appears in household accounts as a managed expense.
The shutter cloth was the ash bank's partner in the war against cold. The term refers to heavy fabric hangings that were installed over windows, either outside the glass or more commonly on the interior. These were not the decorative curtains we associate with modern windows. They were functional insulation, made from the heaviest available materials, lined and sometimes quilted for additional warmth. When properly installed and drawn, shutter cloths could reduce heat loss through windows by half or more.
The materials used for shutter cloths varied by household wealth and availability. The wealthiest houses used heavy wool tapestries, sometimes specifically woven for the purpose, with scenes or patterns that made them decorative as well as functional. Middling households used thick felted wool or layered linen. The poorest might use whatever heavy cloth was available, including recycled blankets or even sailcloth. The key was weight and thickness. The cloth needed to trap air and create a dead space between itself and the cold glass.
The installation of shutter cloths was itself a skilled practice. Simply hanging fabric in front of a window helped somewhat, but proper installation required attention to sealing. The cloth needed to press tightly against the window frame or wall on all sides, preventing cold air from circulating behind it and warm air from escaping around the edges. Metal hooks or wooden pegs held the cloth in place, and sometimes the edges were weighted or tied to ensure a complete seal. A well-installed shutter cloth was essentially an interior storm window, creating a pocket of still air that dramatically reduced convective heat loss.
The daily management of shutter cloths created a rhythm to household life that modern heating has eliminated. The cloths were drawn at dusk, when temperatures began to drop and when the light from the windows was no longer useful. They remained in place through the night and into the morning, opened only when daylight was sufficient for activities and temperatures had risen enough to make the gallery marginally usable. On the coldest days, the cloths might remain drawn entirely, sacrificing light for warmth. The household schedule adapted to these thermal requirements.
The responsibility for managing shutter cloths typically fell to senior servants, often the chamberlain or housekeeper, who understood the household patterns and priorities. The decision of when to draw or open the cloths required judgment. Too early, and the room would be dark when it might be used. Too late, and valuable heat would have escaped. This decision-making authority represented real power within the household hierarchy, and the servant who managed it well earned respect and trust. The combination of ash banks and shutter cloths working together could make a gallery marginally usable in winter rather than completely uninhabitable. The ash blocked cold infiltration at ground level, where the coldest air accumulated. The shutter cloths blocked radiation and convection through the windows. Together, they could raise the temperature of a gallery by 10 or 15 degrees compared to an unprotected room. This was still cold by modern standards, but it was the difference between a room where you could walk briefly in heavy clothing and a room where water would freeze in a glass.
The portrait collections that decorated long galleries were affected by these thermal management practices in ways that shaped their creation and preservation. Paintings were positioned on the interior wall, opposite the windows, where they would receive good light during the day and be protected from the worst of the cold at night. Artists sometimes adjusted their techniques, knowing that their work would often be seen by flickering firelight rather than steady daylight.
The cold itself threatened the paintings. Extreme temperature swings caused canvas and panel to expand and contract, eventually cracking paint and separating layers. Moisture condensation on cold surfaces could damage pigments and promote mold growth. The thermal management systems of the gallery protected not just human comfort, but cultural assets that represented enormous investments of money and status. A lord who let his portrait collection deteriorate through poor heating management was failing in his duty as a custodian of family legacy.
Let me tell you about a specific incident that illustrates what happened when the thermal management system failed. In the winter of 1683-1684, known in England as the Great Frost, temperatures dropped to levels not seen in living memory. The Thames froze solid enough to support frost fairs, and in the great houses of England, the usual preparations proved insufficient. At Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, the household accounts record emergency measures taken when the gallery became dangerously cold despite all precautions.
The Hatfield staff piled additional ash against every exterior wall, not just the windows. They hung every available piece of heavy fabric over the windows, supplementing the purpose-made shutter cloths with bed curtains and even tablecloths. They kept the gallery fireplaces burning around the clock, consuming fuel at 3 times the normal winter rate. They placed portable braziers at intervals along the gallery, accepting the fire risk because the cold risk was worse. And still the housekeeper's records note the gallery was so cold that the family took their exercise in the Great Hall instead, and 2 paintings showed damage from frost.
The damaged paintings at Hatfield were eventually restored, but the incident prompted changes in the household winter protocols. The ash banks were made larger in subsequent years. Additional shutter cloths were commissioned, made from even heavier materials. The positioning of braziers was formalized, with designated locations and procedures. The household had learned from the emergency, converting crisis response into systematic preparation. This kind of adaptive learning happened across the great houses of England, each household developing its own variations on the basic practices. The seasonal rhythm of ash banking and shutter cloth installation structured the calendar of great house maintenance. In autumn, typically late October or early November, the transition to winter configuration began. Ash that had been collected throughout the year was distributed to its winter positions. Shutter cloths that had been stored during warm months were retrieved, inspected for damage, repaired if necessary, and installed. This transition might take several days for a large house with many vulnerable rooms, and it involved significant coordination among the household staff.
The spring transition was equally elaborate, but worked in reverse. When temperatures consistently rose above freezing, typically in late March or April, the shutter cloths came down and went into storage. The ash banks were shoveled away and the ash redistributed to other uses. Windows were cleaned, often for the first time in months, revealing views that had been hidden behind cloth since autumn. The house, in a very real sense, woke up after its winter hibernation, expanding its usable space as rooms that had been marginally functional became fully comfortable again.
The habits that formed around these seasonal transitions extended into every aspect of household life. The timing of major social events often considered the state of the gallery and other vulnerable rooms. Winter entertainments happened in the Great Hall or other rooms that could be adequately heated. Spring entertainments marked the reopening of the gallery for use, celebrating the return of light and warmth. The social calendar was shaped by the thermal calendar, with the house's capacity for hospitality expanding and contracting with the seasons.
The quiet rules that governed thermal management included protocols for behavior in cold rooms. Walking was encouraged because it generated body heat. Standing still was discouraged because the body would cool rapidly in the cold air. Visitors to the gallery were expected to keep moving, admiring the portraits while strolling, rather than stopping to contemplate each one. The pace of movement was itself regulated. Too fast and you would sweat, which would chill you when you stopped. Too slow and you would never warm up. The gallery required a specific tempo of walking, brisk but not rushed, that became associated with the space.
We have established the basic technologies of ash banks and shutter cloths and their role in making galleries marginally habitable in winter. In Part 2, we will examine the household systems that manage these technologies, the servants responsible, the supplies required, the decisions made daily about how to balance warmth against other priorities. We will see how the gallery thermal challenges shaped not just maintenance practices, but social relations within the household. The cold demanded constant attention, and that attention was provided by people whose labour history often overlooks.
The ash is piled, the cloths are drawn, but dawn is still hours away. The person who managed the thermal systems of a great house rarely appears in the histories that celebrate its architecture and inhabitants. They were servants, mostly, and servants' names were not recorded unless they did something notable enough to generate legal documents. But these invisible figures wielded genuine power within the household hierarchy. The servant who controlled when the shutter cloths were drawn, who decided how much ash to bank against which windows, who judged whether the gallery was warm enough for use, made decisions that affected everyone, from the lord to the lowest scullery maid. Their expertise was essential, their judgment trusted, their authority in their domain essentially absolute.
In most great houses, the responsibility for thermal management fell within the housekeeper domain, though the specific arrangement varied. The housekeeper, typically a senior woman who had risen through the household ranks, supervised the indoor servants and managed the supplies they needed to do their work. Ash collection and distribution, shutter cloth installation and maintenance, fire management and fuel allocation, all of these fell under her oversight. She did not personally shovel ash or hang heavy cloths, but she determined when and how these tasks were done, and she answered to the master or mistress if the results were inadequate. The practical work of ash collection was typically assigned to lower servants, often young men whose physical strength was needed for the heavy lifting involved. Ash had to be gathered from fireplaces throughout the house, loaded into barrows or buckets, transported to storage areas, and eventually redistributed to where it was needed for banking. This work was dirty and demanding, covering the workers in fine grey dust that got into clothes and hair and lungs. It was also low-status work, assigned to those at the bottom of the servant hierarchy, who had no choice but to accept whatever tasks they were given. The banking of ash against walls and windows required more skill than simple collection. The ash had to be piled in ways that would stay in place, would not create fire hazards, and would actually provide insulation. Too loose a pile would shift and settle, creating gaps that defeated the purpose. Too densely packed, and the insulating air pockets would be compressed away. The ash also had to be kept dry. Wet ash provided poor insulation and could damage the materials it touched. Senior servants or experienced workers supervised the banking, passing on knowledge about proper technique that had been accumulated over generations.
Let me introduce you to a household document that provides unusual detail about these practices. The Household Book of the Earl of Northumberland, compiled in the early 16th century, includes regulations for virtually every aspect of estate management. Among its provisions are specific instructions for winter preparation that mention ash banking explicitly. The document specifies which servants are responsible, what quantities of ash should be allocated to which rooms, and when the work should be completed. It treats ash management as a routine but important aspect of household operation, comparable to food storage or livestock care. The Northumberland Household Book also reveals the quantities involved. A great house with multiple fireplaces burning continuously through winter could produce hundreds of pounds of ash per week. Most of this was destined for non-insulation uses, soap making, agricultural amendment, cleaning compounds. But a significant portion was reserved for banking, and the allocation was tracked carefully. The book specifies that the ashes of the gallery fires shall be kept separate and used first for the banking of the gallery windows, suggesting that ash quality varied and that the best ash was prioritized for the most demanding applications. If you are still with me, following the trail of ash through the hierarchy of a Tudor great house, you are exactly the audience I make these videos for. The subscribe button is there if you want more of these explorations of how the invisible labor of servants made the visible splendor of aristocratic life possible. Now let us examine the shutter cloth system in more detail, because the labor involved was even more complex than ash management. Shutter cloths were valuable objects, often made from expensive materials and representing significant household investment. They required careful handling to prevent damage, proper storage during warm months to prevent deterioration, and skilled installation to function effectively. The servants who managed shutter cloths were typically more senior than those who handled ash, reflecting the greater value and complexity of the materials involved. The installation of shutter cloths in a long gallery was a substantial undertaking that might require several workers and most of a day. Each cloth had to be retrieved from storage, inspected for damage, and carried to its designated window. The hanging hardware, typically iron hooks or wooden pegs set into the wall, had to be checked and cleaned. The cloth was then lifted into place, a task that required coordination when the cloths were large and heavy. Finally, the edges had to be sealed, either by tying them to fixed points or by weighing them down with rods sewn into hems. The daily operation of shutter cloths was less labor-intensive than installation, but still required regular attention. Someone had to draw the cloths each evening and open them each morning. This someone was usually a chambermaid or footman, who also had other duties, fitting the cloth management into a broader routine of room preparation. The timing required judgment. Draw too early and the room would be dark when it might still be used. Draw too late and valuable heat would have escaped. The servant learned to read the light and the household patterns, developing an intuition for the right moment. The judgment involved in these timing decisions connected thermal management to social awareness. A servant who knew the family plans could anticipate when rooms would be needed and adjust the cloth schedule accordingly. If the family planned to use the gallery for an afternoon visit, the cloths might be opened earlier than usual to let the room warm slightly before their arrival. If the family was away, the cloths might remain drawn to preserve heat and protect the paintings. This kind of anticipatory service was the mark of an experienced household servant, someone who understood not just the mechanical tasks, but their purpose. The fuel supply that kept gallery fireplaces burning was another dimension of the labor required for thermal management. Wood or coal had to be sourced, purchased or collected, transported to the house, stored properly, and distributed to the various fireplaces as needed.
In a large house, this was a significant logistical operation involving multiple workers and considerable planning. The gallery fireplaces, often larger than those in other rooms to compensate for the greater heat loss, consumed proportionally more fuel and required more frequent attention. The servants who tended gallery fires had to balance multiple considerations. A fire too large would waste fuel and create dangerous heat near the fireplace, while doing little for the rest of the room. A fire too small would barely register against the cold pressing in from the windows. The optimal fire was steady but not roaring, maintained through regular attention rather than occasional dramatic interventions. This required someone to check the fire frequently, adding fuel as needed, adjusting the arrangement of logs or coals to promote even burning. Fire tending was often assigned to younger servants, but the gallery fires might warrant more experienced attention.
The threat of fire was a constant concern in houses filled with ash, fabric, and open flames. The same shuttercloths that preserved warmth could become catastrophic if a spark reached them. The same ash banks that insulated walls could smoulder undetected if hot embers were carelessly discarded. The servants who managed thermal systems were therefore also managing fire risk, a responsibility that added weight to their duties. A moment of carelessness could destroy not just a room, but an entire house, killing inhabitants and erasing centuries of accumulated wealth.
Let me tell you about a specific fire that illustrates these risks. In 1698, Whitehall Palace in London was largely destroyed by a fire that started when a maid placed hot charcoal too close to shuttercloths in a gallery room. The cloths caught fire, the flames spread rapidly through the fabric-heavy decorations of the palace, and within hours, most of the great complex that had served as the primary royal residence for over a century was reduced to ruins. The inquiry that followed blamed the maid, but also identified systemic failures in the supervision of fire risks. The tragedy demonstrated what everyone already knew. Thermal management and fire management were inseparable, and both required constant vigilance. The Whitehall fire prompted changes in thermal management practices across England's great houses. Shuttercloths were inspected more carefully for damage that might make them more flammable. Ash banks were positioned to ensure that hot embers could not accidentally be incorporated. Fire tending protocols were formalized, with specific instructions about where fuel could be stored and how fires should be managed. The tragedy became a teaching example, invoked by housekeepers when training new servants in the importance of careful attention to these seemingly mundane duties. The quiet rules that governed thermal management extended into relations between servants themselves. The hierarchy of tasks, from low-status ash collection to higher-status cloth management, created differentiation within the servant community. Those who had risen to trusted positions guarded their authority jealously, while those at the bottom looked for opportunities to demonstrate competence and earn advancement. The thermal management system was thus a site of internal politics, where performance could raise or lower a servant's standing. Communication between servants was essential to effective thermal management. The person who knew the family plans for the day needed to inform the person who controlled the shuttercloths. The person who managed the ash supply needed to coordinate with the person who banked it. The fire tenders needed to know when rooms would be occupied. This communication happened through informal networks of conversation and observation, with information flowing along channels that reflected both official hierarchy and personal relationships. A housekeeper who maintained good relations with the kitchen staff, for example, might get earlier warning of when visitors were expected.
The relationship between thermal management and the master authority was complex. On one hand, the master set overall priorities and could intervene in any aspect of household operation. On the other hand, the master typically knew less about the practical details than the servants who handled them daily. A wise master trusted his housekeeper's judgment about when shutter-cloths should be drawn, just as a wise commander trusted his sergeants about practical military matters. The household functioned best when authority at different levels was respected and when information flowed smoothly between them.
The costs of thermal management appeared in household accounts as both regular expenses and occasional emergencies. Regular expenses included fuel purchases, which might consume a significant portion of the annual budget, and materials for maintaining the shutter-cloths and other equipment. Emergency expenses appeared when systems failed, additional fuel during unusually cold winters, repairs to damaged paintings or furnishings, replacement of cloths that had worn out or been destroyed. A well-managed household minimized emergencies through consistent maintenance, but no amount of preparation could prevent all problems. The seasonal rhythm of thermal management labor created periods of intense activity, separated by periods of maintenance. The autumn transition to winter configuration required extra hands and extended hours. The spring transition was equally demanding. Between these peaks, the daily work of fire tending and cloth drawing continued at a steady pace. Servants who worked in thermal management thus experienced the year as a cycle of intensity and routine, with predictable crests of activity that they could prepare for and recover from.
The health effects of thermal management work were real but rarely documented. Servants who handled ash regularly inhaled dust that could damage their lungs over time. Those who worked in cold galleries for extended periods suffered the same cold-related health effects as their masters, but without the warm private chambers to retreat to. Those who tended fires developed burns and calluses from constant exposure to heat. The physical costs of keeping great houses warm fell disproportionately on the servants whose labor made warmth possible.
The knowledge that thermal management required was passed down through practice and observation. New servants learned by watching experienced ones, by having their mistakes corrected, by gradually being trusted with more complex tasks. This oral tradition meant that knowledge was vulnerable to disruption when key personnel left or died. A household that lost an experienced housekeeper might struggle through several winters before someone else developed equivalent expertise. The knowledge was real and valuable, but it was held in people rather than documents. Some households tried to formalize this knowledge in written instructions, producing the household manuals we sometimes find in archives. These documents captured some of the explicit knowledge, the procedures and schedules and quantities, but struggled to convey the tacit knowledge, the judgment calls and intuitions that separated adequate performance from excellent. A servant reading a manual might learn when to draw shutter-cloths, but not how to judge when the conditions warranted an exception. The gap between written instructions and practical competence was filled by experience, one winter at a time. The threats that thermal management addressed went beyond cold and fire. Moisture was an enemy that the ash banks and shutter-cloths also combated. Cold surfaces attracted condensation, and condensation promoted mold and rot. The same systems that kept rooms warmer also kept them drier, protecting not just comfort, but the physical fabric of the house itself. A gallery left unprotected through winter might emerge in spring with damaged plaster, peeling paint, and rotting woodwork. The investment in thermal management paid dividends in preservation as well as comfort. The pest management implications of thermal management were also significant. Insects and rodents sought warmth just as humans did, and the warm spaces created by effective heating became attractive to unwanted visitors. The ash banks could harbour insects if not properly maintained. The shutter cloths could shelter moths that would damage the fabric. The servants who managed thermal systems also watched for these secondary threats, incorporating pest vigilance into their rounds. The warmth they created required defense against those who would exploit it. In our final part, we will examine how these practices evolved and eventually disappeared as heating technology advanced. We will trace the transition from ash banks and shutter cloths to the central heating systems that now keep our museums and galleries comfortable year-round. We will consider what was lost when this labor-intensive system gave way to automated climate control. And we will ask what the Great House Gallery can teach us about the invisible work that makes comfort possible in any era.
The fire needs tending. The night is cold, but someone is watching.
The transition away from ash banks and shutter cloths happened gradually, driven by technological changes that made these labor-intensive practices unnecessary. The first major change was the improvement of glass itself. By the 18th century, glass-making techniques had advanced to the point where larger, clearer, and more consistently flat panes could be produced. More importantly for our story, double glazing appeared, trapping a layer of air between two panes of glass that dramatically reduced heat loss. A gallery with double-glazed windows was still cold by modern standards, but it was far easier to heat than one with single glazing.
The second major change was the development of more efficient heating systems. The open fireplace, which dominated English domestic heating for centuries, was gradually supplemented and then replaced by closed stoves, which trapped heat more effectively and distributed it more evenly. Later came central heating systems that used hot water or steam circulating through pipes to deliver warmth throughout a building. A gallery heated by such a system no longer needed ash banks at the windows or shutter cloths over them. The technology had changed, and the old practices became obsolete.
The obsolescence was not immediate or universal. Great houses are conservative institutions, and practices that had worked for generations were not abandoned simply because something new appeared. Some houses maintained their traditional thermal management systems well into the 19th century, even as newer houses were built with modern heating from the start. The transition happened household by household, room by room, as old equipment wore out and was replaced with new, as old servants retired and new ones arrived without the traditional skills, as masters made decisions about where to invest their resources.
The shutter cloths were often the first element to go. They were expensive to maintain, prone to damage from moths and moisture, and increasingly unfashionable as lighter window treatments became popular. The heavy tapestries that had served double duty as insulation and decoration were replaced by lighter curtains that were purely decorative, incapable of providing meaningful thermal protection, but also not requiring the elaborate installation and maintenance that shutter cloths demanded. The loss was aesthetic as well as practical, as the dramatic effect of heavy cloths drawn against the winter night gave way to more refined but less substantial window treatments.
The ash banks persisted longer in some households, partly because they cost nothing to maintain, partly because the practice was so deeply embedded in household routines. But they too eventually disappeared, as the improved heating made them unnecessary, and as changing standards of cleanliness made piles of ash against the walls seem unacceptably dirty. The same household that would once have seen ash banking as essential maintenance came to see it as an embarrassing relic of a cruder era. Progress, as always, involved forgetting as well as learning.
Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. We have traveled through centuries of thermal management history, from the first long galleries to the last ash banks, from the servants who made warmth possible to the technologies that made servants unnecessary. If this story has changed how you think about the hidden labor behind historical comfort, I would be grateful if you would subscribe and share your thoughts. What surprised you most? What connections do you see to your own relationship with heating and shelter? I read every single comment. Now let me bring this story to its conclusion, because the gallery and its thermal challenges reveal something important about the relationship between technology, labor, and comfort that remains relevant today.
The great house galleries that survive today are museum spaces, open to visitors who wander through them without any awareness of the thermal challenges they once presented. The Hardwicke Gallery, with its famous windows, is now climate-controlled by systems that maintain stable temperature and humidity year-round. The National Trust, which manages many of England's surviving great houses, employs specialists in heritage climate control who use sophisticated monitoring equipment to protect the paintings and furnishings that fill these spaces. The work continues, but it has been transformed from visible servant labour to invisible technological management.
The museum visitors who walk through these galleries in January, wearing light jackets or even just sweaters, experience the space in a way its original inhabitants never could. They can stand still to contemplate a portrait for as long as they like, without their bodies cooling dangerously. They can visit any room in the house without considering whether it has been prepared for occupation. The seasonal rhythm that once governed which spaces could be used has been eliminated entirely. The house has been frozen in its summer configuration, accessible year-round, but also somehow less authentic, less connected to the realities that shaped how it was actually lived in.
Some heritage sites have experimented with demonstrating historical thermal management practices. Living history programs at places like Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia include demonstrations of fire tending and discussions of how colonial Americans kept warm. But these demonstrations necessarily happen in the context of modern heating, with interpreters who can retreat to heated break rooms and visitors who arrived in heat and will return to heated homes. The demonstration conveys information but cannot convey experience. The cold that shaped historical behaviour remains abstract, intellectual, never felt in the bones the way the original inhabitants felt it.
The knowledge that thermal management required has largely been lost. The housekeepers who understood exactly how to install shuttercloths for maximum effectiveness, the servants who knew which ash to use where, the fire tenders who could maintain optimal gallery fires through long winter nights, all of these people took their expertise with them when they died or retired. Some fragments survive in written records, but the tacit knowledge, the feel for when things were right, has vanished. We can reconstruct the practices intellectually, but we cannot resurrect the skill.
This loss of knowledge is a recurring pattern in technological transitions. When a new technology makes an old one obsolete, the skills associated with the old technology lose their value and gradually disappear. The people who possessed those skills retire or die. The apprentices who would have learned from them are never trained. Within a generation or two, practices that were once universal become historical curiosities, accessible only through archaeological investigation or lucky documentary survival. The ash banks and shuttercloths have joined a long list of once essential technologies that modern people know about, if at all, only through deliberate historical study. The relationship between comfort and labour that the gallery illustrates has not disappeared, merely transformed. Modern climate control systems require enormous infrastructure: power plants, electrical grids, manufacturing facilities for HVAC equipment, supply chains for refrigerants and filters and replacement parts. The labour has been distributed across a global economy rather than concentrated in a single household. The servant who once tended the gallery fire has been replaced by thousands of workers in dozens of industries, each contributing some small part to the comfort we take for granted.
This distribution makes the labour invisible in a different way than servant labour was invisible. The Tudor servant was invisible because their work happened in the background, unnoticed by those who benefited from it. The modern worker is invisible because they are far away, their contribution mediated through supply chains and corporate structures that obscure the human effort involved. We turn on the heat without thinking about the coal miners, the power plant operators, the engineers who designed the furnace, the factory workers who built it.
The labour has not disappeared. It has been hidden by distance and complexity.
The environmental implications of this transformation are significant. The ash banks and shutter cloths were sustainable technologies in a way that modern heating systems are not. The ash came from renewable wood, burned in small quantities in individual fireplaces. The shutter cloths were made from natural fibres that could be composted at the end of their useful life. The system was local, low-tech, and integrated with natural cycles. Modern climate control relies on fossil fuels, manufactured chemicals, and global supply chains that contribute to climate change. We have solved the problem of keeping galleries warm, but we have created new problems in the process.
Some modern sustainable building designers have looked back at historical thermal management practices for inspiration. The principle of using heavy fabric to create insulating air pockets appears in contemporary passive house design. The practice of sealing vulnerable areas during cold periods appears in window insulation kits marketed to energy-conscious homeowners. The understanding that maintenance and active management can substitute for technological brute force appears in green building philosophy generally. The old wisdom has not been entirely lost, merely reframed in contemporary terms.
The behavioural adaptations that cold galleries required have also left traces in modern culture. The habit of walking rather than standing when viewing art in museums may derive partly from the gallery tradition of keeping moving to stay warm. The seasonal rhythm of social events, with formal occasions concentrated in certain months, may reflect the historical limitations on which spaces could be heated to comfortable temperatures. These connections are speculative, difficult to prove, but they suggest that the thermal realities of historical life have left marks on practices that persist even after the original reasons have been forgotten. The gallery, as a symbol of aristocratic power, has an ironic dimension when we understand its thermal reality. The room that proclaimed the owner's wealth and taste was also a room that was barely usable for much of the year. The portraits that demonstrated the family lineage and connections hung in a space where viewing them was often uncomfortable or impossible. The architectural statement that said, "We can afford this extravagance," also said, "We will suffer for this extravagance," even if that second message was never spoken aloud. Prestige and practicality were in tension, and prestige won. The servants who made the gallery marginally usable were caught in this tension. Their labour enabled the prestige that justified the space's existence, but that prestige could never be fully realized because the space could never be fully comfortable. They worked to make possible something that remained always partly impossible. This is perhaps the deepest irony of the gallery thermal management. All that effort, all that skill, all that daily attention, and the room was still cold. The ash banks and shutter cloths were victories in a war that could never be fully won.
Modern climate control has won that war, at least within the buildings where it operates. We can now create any thermal environment we want, regardless of exterior conditions. The gallery that once required daily management and constant vigilance can now be maintained at precise temperature and humidity with minimal human intervention. The victory is real, and we should not romanticize the discomfort that preceded it. But the victory has costs, environmental and social, that we are only beginning to understand.
The story of ash banks and shutter cloths is ultimately a story about the relationship between humans and their built environments. For most of history, that relationship was intimate and demanding. Buildings required constant attention to function. They changed with the seasons in ways that shaped how they could be used. They connected their inhabitants to natural cycles of warmth and cold, light and dark. Modern buildings have severed many of these connections, creating interior environments that are stable, regardless of what happens outside. We have gained comfort and convenience,
We have lost something harder to name, a sense of participation in the physical world that our ancestors experienced daily.
The gallery windows that were once the problem have become, in preserved great houses, the attraction. Visitors come specifically to see those walls of glass, to admire the architectural ambition they represent, to photograph the views they frame. The same features that made the room thermally impossible make it visually stunning. The builders who designed those galleries knew what they were creating: beauty that came at a cost, splendor that required sacrifice. They made their choice, and generations of servants paid for it. And now we benefit from both the beauty and the sacrifice, without fully understanding either.
The ash is gone now. The shuttercloths hang in storage rooms or museum collections, fragile survivors of a practice no one living remembers. The galleries are warm, maintained by invisible systems that require no daily attention. The portraits gaze down from walls that no longer threaten them with condensation and frost. The servants who once kept this all functioning have been replaced by HVAC technicians and climate control specialists, whose work is equally essential but differently organized. The warmth we enjoy is still produced by labor. It is simply labor we no longer see.
Every building you enter has a thermal management system. It might be as simple as a furnace and some insulation. It might be as complex as the climate control systems in major museums. It was designed by someone, installed by someone, maintained by someone. The comfort you feel is the product of their work, even though you never see them and probably never think about them. The invisible labor continues. It has merely changed form. The next time you walk through a long gallery in a historic house, or any large room with many windows, consider for a moment what it would have taken to make that space usable before modern heating. Imagine the ash piled against the windows, the heavy cloths drawn tight each evening, the fires tended through long winter nights. Imagine the servants who did this work, whose names we will never know, whose skill made possible the comfort of people whose names fill the history books. The cold they fought is gone now, but the memory of their fight deserves to survive.
The gallery is warm tonight. The portraits are safe. The windows are clear, revealing views that were hidden for months at a time when the shutter cloths were drawn. Someone, somewhere, made this possible. Someone always does. The fire has burned low. The night is ending. Thank you for walking through this cold gallery with me.
Good night. Stay warm.